So I know what everyone will say. This looks exactly like the NZXT H6, and it does look in many ways very similar because the concept is identical, redirecting front airflow to be angled as to not interfere with the visual aesthetics of the enclosure while still giving you a very beautiful angle at the front. But fun fact, we received the email to review this concept enclosure in July of 2023, way before NZXT announced its H6. And so I'm finally happy to see that APNX V1 is out, and it is pretty awesome. For me, this case format is actually more desirable than your traditional dual chamber fish tank look, partially because of better airflow delivery from the side. Even though it's angled and it will bounce around over there, it still will help with better GPU cooling. But also footprint wise, it's just a tiny bit wider than your traditional mid-tower, while looking quite different versus everything else that's on the market. But let me know if you agree. So starting with the unboxing, the case is not that heavy, but it still comes in 2 boxes for protection. Beautiful. The unboxing sequence is identical to what you would find with the Haven 420. And in fact, they share the same brand. So APNX and Haven are owned by the same company, which is why the similarities behind the packaging. We even have similar guiding stickers on the case that have a little tab for easier peeling. Price-wise, you're looking at $120 to $150, depending on the color and the wood trim. And I really appreciate the availability of the black and white model for that a little extra contrast. I have the black and white model with the wood trim that I would say would suit in any setup space just fine, unless you're Iskren.
Who put that here?
And for this price, you actually don't get any fans, which is an advantage for the NZXT H6, because at $109, you still have those 3 front angled fans. I don't know why, but I am starting to notice more imperfections and worse wood in general on most recent enclosures, and the APNX V1 is no exception. Like, the pieces of wood are not warped, which is good, but there is some roughness around the edges, even facing you. Like, I don't care if there's like some rough edges on the interior of the wood. Perhaps it's not ideal, but it's not the end of the world. Like, certain sections are beautifully and smooth, like they should be, but then other sections are rough around the edges, and I wonder why. Perhaps we just got a little bit unlucky with this part of the wood. There's also a difference between the grain that is beautiful, you can feel it, but the wood is still very nicely sealed. Like, this is very smooth. Now, despite the imperfections, I do appreciate the functional design behind this front panel. So it's easily removable from the actual frame. We have a magnetic dust filter that is the high performance kind, so really good for dust filtration and really good for airflow. And we do have the plastic frame of the actual filter that corresponds exactly to the plastic frame and the wood elements on the front panel. So there's no restriction, or minimal restriction, just because of how perfectly they align together. I gotta say, I love all the easy access, but you do have to be careful with this handle at the back for the rear panel. It's not a handle for the enclosure, it's just a handle so that you can remove the top panel easier. Both the glass panel and the rear one have a screw holding them at the top for safe shipment, but it's not necessary to have that included after assembly, just because the pegs are actually fairly strong. I will say the ventilation pattern on our solid panel is pretty, but it doesn't match the rest of the stuff. Like, at the back, we have large squares instead of the small ones. At least everything is properly dust proof with these fine performance mesh filters. And the bottom filter is just slightly annoying because it's not exactly smooth coming out. Weirdly, the accessory kit is kind of pointless. I don't understand why it has to be inside a paper box, just because there's almost nothing in it. I do appreciate the extra plastic clips for our toolless pegs. The center part might get loose or break over time, so it's nice to have extras. At least though, the plastic baggies are labeled so you know what's inside. And probably one of the most important small things in here is this motherboard standoff removal bit. And one of the reasons why this motherboard standoff removal tool is so important is because the APNX V1 has 2 motherboard positions without the requirement of needing to remove motherboard trays and reconfiguring the frame, which is super handy. And the reconfiguration is very simple. More on that right after a message from today's video sponsor. Montech with another insane value product, the Hyperflow ARGB AIOs, available in black or white, 240 or 360 sizes, with full platform compatibility and friendly tools along the way that not only look gorgeous with pump lighting and matching blade illumination, but also performance that should satisfy with any hot silicon, thanks to high-speed fans, high-density fins on the rad, a good pump, and daisy-chain fans for easy cable management, all backed by this 6-year warranty, so you don't have to worry. Check it out below. Okay, so this is why the adjustable motherboard position is so clever with this case, is because you don't have to remove anything from the back of the enclosure. All you have to do is adjust the motherboard standoffs to be in a slightly higher position, and they're clearly marked on the motherboard tray with the arrow down and the arrow up sign, so you cannot really confuse them. In the lowest position, you still have plenty of space for fans to deliver airflow for the GPU, but granting you way more space for radiators and set of fans above the motherboard. And with the motherboard in the upper position, you still have plenty of clearance for a radiator and set of fans, but now, for example, if you go with the vertical GPU, you have way more space down here to have stuff to breathe. Additionally, this piece at the back is both your logo for design purposes, but it also has a function by covering up the extra length of the motherboard I/O, depending on your motherboard orientation. With the motherboard in the upper position, this would go here and just a thumb screw away. So first of all, look at how easy it is to remove the bottom panel, just a single thumb screw, and you slide it to release in this direction. The top panel has 6 screws. It conveniently sits inside its own little pocket and is inserted from the top. Beautiful. And the side bracket only has 3 thumb screws. And this front angled bracket is actually very clever, because at first glance you see it and you're thinking, well, it's gonna have a lot of blockages for our larger fans for like 140 and 160 millimeters, but in fact you can remove the 120 rails to open up this bracket even more. This is what it looks like with 120 fans. You remove one of the rails, doesn't matter which one, to give you access to 140 mil mounts. You can only do 2 140s in here and use one of the rails to guide your cables. And alternatively, if you have 160 millimeters fans, you can remove all the rails altogether to give this absolutely open bracket, and this is exactly how fan brackets should go from now on. This is a brilliant and a hassle-free design. So what that means is that you can do a 360 at the front, at the bottom, and at the top simultaneously, and because you have that motherboard height adjustment, you can kind of configure where you need that additional thickness for the radiator instead of fans. This glass can be removed for easy access of your internals. Now the thing is, once all the side panels and all the interior fan brackets are removed, there is a lot of flex happening within the frame. This is definitely something that plagues dual chamber enclosures that don't have the structural support on this corner. And there's not too much flex happening when you press from the top, but there's quite a lot of bending happening on the actual frame level. I mean, it could be better, but at least once the front glass is installed, it does limit some of that frame flexing. Now with the Fractal Design North that has a very similar front facade, I had noise issues. The fans were way too close to the front panel. There was way too much turbulence, and I am worried it might be the same situation here. Let's take a listen. All right, so it seems like running the fans, even though I'm running them at full power at 2500 RPM, it seems like the front panel does introduce a slight different noise profile, but it's not crazy. Like, airflow just gets through without too much acoustic turbulence. Nice. I do appreciate the symmetrical I/O with the illuminated power button and the Gen 2 USB-C, and we also have this switch over here. Initially, I thought this was a reset switch, but it's not. It's meant to plug into an ARGB hub that has a 2-pin connector, so you can cycle between different effects and stuff. You could still configure this as a reset switch, but you can't because the I/O hub is unified, which is great, but then you are left with a useless switch. Okay, so now the system is complete, I have some thoughts. Overall, it's a pleasant experience. I would say better than the H6 from NZXT just because of all the removable fan brackets and being able to work with those brackets way easier, especially that front angle bracket and how you can configure it for 120, 140, or 160s. Unfortunately, no 180 support, but that would make that angled width way wider than it is now, and I really appreciate the sort of relatively compact footprint of the APNX V1. Now, having more experience with this enclosure and having built multiple systems, I will point out the fact that there's just an uncomfortable amount of bending happening even with our front glass installed. When the side glass is in place, it kind of tends to really solidify the frame and the structure, but otherwise, this is a little bit too much for my liking. On the interior, I absolutely love the built-in GPU holder with 2 thumb screws, so regardless of how heavy your graphics cards would be, it will prevent any sag. So you guys heard me rave about the motherboard standoff removal tool. I think I got jinxed just because one of the threads on the motherboard standoff is stripped. I can take it out, but no replacement motherboard standoffs is included. APNX Y. That is not okay to have one of the fundamental features behind this case to be able to move the motherboard up and down, but then not include any extra standoffs because, of course, you're going to be working with standoffs every single time you have to move the motherboard up or down. Also, with the motherboard in the lower position, it doesn't seem like you have any issues accessing the CPU cooler backplate. Despite having a fairly small CPU cutout opening for the motherboard tray, with the motherboard in the upper position, I can still access all 4 points for that backplate of the cooler. The only real minor disadvantage of having the motherboard in the upper position is this cutout at the bottom, because the cable will have to travel slightly more to get to the bottom I/O, for example, so just something you have to deal with. I do appreciate this small cutout on our power supply platform, just so that you can pass smallish cables behind it. You just have to make sure to do this before you insert the power supply. I am not a huge fan of that center cutout here for our fans, just because for daisy chain fans like this, where the cable exits either at the top or the bottom, it would have been great to have another cutout at the top or the bottom so that you don't lose this much length of your cable just trying to exit. Initially, I thought I would hate working with these rubber grommets, and I still have mixed feelings just because passing cables is a little difficult, but the way the rubber grommet is designed allows for the cable to exit cleanly without revealing anything behind it. Of course, I appreciate easy access for our PCI screw, so the frame is cut out appropriately. I love the location of the power supply. Even though it blocks our CPU cutout, all the cables reach to where they need to be seamlessly. And the storage bracket underneath is actually very clever. It is magnetically attached, but also has screws for secure attachment. It is easily removable and can house 6 SSDs or 4 SSDs and 2 3.5-inch drives. And as for general cable management, I absolutely love these Velcro cable tie points, just because you can apply tension and really secure your cables flat to the base behind the motherboard tray and still not interfere with our storage bracket. I'm also a huge fan of these tiny lips and notches on the frame and the side panel that allows you to just easily align them together and close it. Available on the glass panel as well. Oh gosh, fingerprints. As for temperatures, I would say this is perfectly suitable for an AIO or an air cooling system. It just does not come with any fans, so you have to populate your own. But populating my own P28 fans in there, it's a solid performer in terms of CPU and GPU temperatures. I would say get decent fans for the front, and they are kind of hidden, so they don't have to necessarily match to every other fan that you have inside the system. Doing some fog work was interesting because you can see how much air is being exhausted from the top, even though I had no fans populated in there. So the front fans are pushing so much air out of the case, it just exits from the top immediately. And always remember that populating more fans inside the case, especially here, would not necessarily give you better temperatures. It would give you flexibility to adjust the RPM of those fans to make the system much quieter and to just balance out the intake versus exhaust and versus intake for the bottom, for example. So just keep that in mind. Overall, I would say this is a solid case. The only questionable part is the flexibility of the frame. I'm not so keen on that, but it's a stunning enclosure, and I would say competitively priced just because of all the really easy fan brackets to access, and that's not something that we normally used to. It's also not that many cases that offer angled front intake aside from the NZXT H6, and I would say this is a better enclosure overall, but you will have to buy your own fans. All right, guys, I'm Dimitri. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know what you think of the APNX V1 in the comments. I'll talk to you in the next video.